I signed away everything I had left, and they smiled like they'd already won. The pen felt heavier than it should have in my hand, like it carried more than ink, like it carried the weight of 37 years of marriage, of every birthday cake I baked, every Christmas morning I woke up before dawn just to see my son smile, every quiet sacrifice that no one ever noticed because that's what mothers do, we give, and we don't keep score. The room was too bright for a day like that. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the attorney's office, catching the polished wood table, the neat stack of papers in front of me, and the satisfied expression on Ashley's face as she sat beside my son like she belonged there more than I ever had. Daniel didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his eyes fixed on the documents, his jaw tight, like this was just another business transaction, something to get through before lunch. I noticed that first. The way he avoided me. The way his fingers tapped against the table, impatient, almost eager. It wasn't grief. It wasn't hesitation. It was something colder. "It's for the best, Mom," he said finally, his voice careful, rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. I nodded slowly, as if I agreed, as if I hadn't heard those same words in different forms over the past week, each time cutting a little deeper. Ashley leaned forward then, her perfume sharp and expensive, her smile soft but calculated. "This will make things simpler for everyone," she added, her tone gentle in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Simpler. That word echoed in my mind. I had spent decades making things simple for them. I made sure the house ran smoothly, that dinner was always on the table, that Daniel never had to worry about anything growing up. And now, suddenly, I was the complication. I lowered my gaze to the paper. Legal language filled the page, terms and conditions, transfers and rights, signatures and dates. It all blurred together after a while, but I understood enough. This wasn't just paperwork. This was the moment they erased me. Not loudly. Not cruelly. But efficiently. I picked up the pen. For a second, just a second, I let myself feel it, the sting, the quiet disbelief, the realization that the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street was now sitting across from me, waiting for me to disappear from his life as neatly as signing my name. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because I agreed. But because I understood something they didn't. I signed. Slowly. Carefully. My name looked smaller than I remembered. The attorney cleared his throat, gathering the documents as if this was routine, as if this happened every day. Maybe it did. People giving away pieces of their lives without anyone noticing the moment it all changed. Ashley exhaled softly, almost like relief. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders. They thought it was over. That was the part that almost made me laugh. Because as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching them exchange a glance they thought I didn't see, I realized something very simple. They hadn't destroyed my life. They had only shown me who they really were. And once you see the truth, really see it, you can't unsee it. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't beg. I simply stood up, thanked the attorney, and walked out of that office with the same quiet dignity I had carried my entire life. But this time, there was something else beneath it. Something colder. Something sharper. They thought they had taken everything from me. What they didn't understand was this. When you've spent your whole life giving, you learn exactly where everything is kept. And I knew exactly where the truth was. And when the time came, I was going to let it speak for me. The house felt different when I walked back in that afternoon, as if something invisible had shifted while I was gone, like the walls themselves were quietly acknowledging what had just happened. I set my keys down in the small ceramic bowl by the door, the one Daniel had made in elementary school, uneven edges and all, and for a moment I let my fingers rest against it longer than necessary. It had always been there, always part of the routine, just like everything else I had built in this home. Except now, nothing felt like it belonged to me anymore. I moved slowly through the hallway, my footsteps softer than usual, as if I were a guest in a place I had lived in for over 3 decades. The living room was exactly as I had left it that morning. The throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of the couch, the framed family photos lining the shelves, each one capturing a version of us that felt increasingly distant. Daniel at 10 years old, missing his front tooth and grinning at the camera. Daniel at his college graduation, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, proud and certain and still looking at me like I mattered. I stopped there for a moment, studying that picture, searching for something familiar in his eyes, something that connected that boy to the man who had just sat across from me and signed me out of his future. I did not find it. I walked into the kitchen next. The clock above the stove read 3:15 in the afternoon, but it felt much later, like the day had stretched beyond its natural limits. I opened the refrigerator out of habit, even though I was not hungry. Leftovers sat neatly labeled, containers stacked in careful rows, the result of years of discipline and quiet planning. I had always made sure there was enough. Enough food, enough stability, enough care. That had been my role. And now, standing there in the soft hum of the refrigerator light, I realized something simple. No one had ever asked if there was enough for me. I closed the door gently and leaned against the counter, letting the silence settle around me. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was just there, steady and present, like the truth itself. Ashley's voice echoed faintly in my memory. "This will make things simpler for everyone." I almost smiled again at that. Simpler. She had been working toward this for longer than I had realized. I could see it now, the small moments I had dismissed at the time. The way she insisted on managing certain bills. The way she redirected conversations whenever finances came up. The subtle changes in Daniel's behavior, how he began to defer to her in ways that felt unnatural, how he stopped asking for my opinion on things that once mattered. It had not happened overnight. It never does. It happens quietly, piece by piece, until one day you look around and realize you have been moved out of your own life without ever being told. I walked upstairs, my hand gliding along the banister polished smooth by years of use. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as if I were retracing something important. When I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway. The room was still, untouched, carrying the faint scent of familiarity that had not yet faded. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, folding my hands in my lap the same way I had in the attorney's office. For a long moment, I did nothing. I did not cry. I did not question. I simply sat there, letting everything settle into place. Because beneath the quiet, beneath the stillness, something else had begun to form. Not anger. Not even sadness. Clarity. They believed I had given up. That I had accepted their version of reality without question. That I would step aside quietly and allow them to take what they thought was theirs. And perhaps, on the surface, that is exactly what I had done. But as I looked around that room, at the life I had built, and the pieces they thought they had taken from me, I understood something they did not. I had not lost control. I had simply stopped interrupting them while they revealed who they truly were. And now that I knew, truly knew, there was no need to rush, no need to react. The truth does not need urgency. It only needs the right moment. And I was willing to wait for it. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale strip of sunlight creeping across the bedroom floor and the quiet hum of a house that no longer felt like mine, and for a few seconds after I opened my eyes I allowed myself to stay perfectly still, listening, because sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could, and that was when I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the soft murmur of voices downstairs. Ashley's voice carrying just enough edge to it that I could recognize it even through a closed door, followed by Daniel's lower tone, calmer, controlled, as if he were trying to manage something rather than question it, and I sat up slowly, my movements deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled over everything, because I understood now that timing mattered, that observation mattered, and that once you started paying attention, you could no longer pretend not to see what was right in front of you. I stepped into the hallway and paused at the top of the stairs, resting my hand lightly against the wall, listening more closely this time, and though I could not make out every word, certain phrases came through clearly enough to form a picture. "Transfer finalized," Ashley said, her voice sharper now, followed by a pause. Then, "We just need to make sure everything is in place before she changes her mind." And Daniel responded, "She will not, it is done." His tone firm but distant, as if he were reassuring himself as much as her, and something about the way he said it settled into me, not painfully, not even bitterly, but with a clarity that felt almost cold, because it told me exactly where I stood, not as a mother, not as someone to be considered, but as a completed step in a process they had already moved beyond. I descended the stairs quietly, each step measured, and by the time I reached the bottom, their conversation had shifted into something lighter, something casual, like a curtain being pulled over what had just been said, and when I stepped into the kitchen, Ashley turned toward me with that same polished smile she had worn the day before, bright and effortless, as if nothing had changed. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm in a way that felt carefully constructed, and I returned the greeting with a small nod, matching her tone without mirroring her intention, while Daniel stood by the counter, his coffee cup in hand, avoiding my eyes once again, and it was in that moment, more than any other, that I realized how complete the shift had been, how thoroughly I had been repositioned in my own home without a single direct confrontation. "I made some eggs," Ashley continued, gesturing toward the stove. "If you would like some." And I thanked her politely, though I had no intention of eating, because what I needed in that moment was not comfort, not routine, but understanding, and understanding requires space, so I poured myself a glass of water instead, the simple act grounding me, giving me something steady to hold on to while everything else rearranged itself around me. Daniel cleared his throat then, as if remembering something important. "We will need to go over a few more details later," he said, still not quite meeting my gaze, "just to make sure everything transitions smoothly." And I nodded again, calm, agreeable, giving them exactly what they expected to see, because there is a certain advantage in being underestimated, in allowing others to believe they have already secured the outcome. And as I stood there, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, I began to notice the smaller details I had once overlooked: the folder Ashley had set on the counter, partially open, papers neatly organized inside, the subtle way she positioned herself slightly in front of Daniel whenever he spoke, as if guiding the direction of the conversation without appearing to do so, the quiet confidence in her posture that suggested not hope, but certainty. Later that morning, after they had both left the house, I returned to the kitchen and stood in front of that same counter, the silence now complete, and I looked at the folder for a long moment before opening it, not out of impulse, but out of intention, because this was no longer about reacting, it was about seeing clearly, and as I lifted the first page, scanning the neatly printed lines, I felt that same calm settle over me again, steady and unshaken, because what I saw there was not confusion, not complexity, but a pattern, one that had been carefully constructed, yes, but not without flaws, and as I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where it had been, I understood something that changed everything. They believed the story had already been written, that the outcome was fixed, but what they did not realize was that I had just found the first piece of the truth that would eventually unravel it all. And I did not need to rush, I did not need to confront, because the strongest revelations do not come from force, they come from patience, and I had spent a lifetime learning how to wait. That afternoon I did not rush to uncover everything at once, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes were something I could no longer afford, so instead I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, letting my eyes rest on details I had once overlooked, the kind of details that only become visible when you stop assuming everything is as it should be, and it was remarkable how much revealed itself when I allowed silence to do the work for me. I returned to the living room and stood in front of the bookshelf where I had kept our financial binders for years, each one labeled in my own handwriting, organized down to the smallest receipt, because I had always believed that order created security, and for a long time it had. But now, as I ran my fingers along the spines, I noticed something subtle yet undeniable. One of the binders was slightly out of place, shifted just enough that it no longer aligned perfectly with the others, and I knew immediately that it had been moved, not recently, but not long ago either, and certainly not by me. I pulled it out carefully and opened it, flipping through the pages with steady hands, not searching for something specific at first, just observing, letting the pattern emerge naturally. And that was when I saw it. Small changes in entries, adjustments that were easy to miss unless you knew exactly what had been there before, numbers rounded differently, dates altered by just a few days, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise suspicion on its own. But together they formed something else. Entirely, something intentional. I closed the binder slowly and placed it back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the others as if nothing had been disturbed, because the moment you reveal what you know too soon is the moment you lose your advantage, and I was not going to make that mistake. Instead, I moved into the study, the one room that had always felt like my husband's domain, though in truth we had shared everything, even if the world outside had never quite seen it that way, and I paused at the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, taking in the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood, the quiet dignity of a space that had held so many decisions, so many plans, and I walked over to the desk, my hand resting lightly on its surface, remembering the countless evenings we had spent there, going over documents together, discussing investments, making choices that shaped our future, choices that had always included me. I opened the top drawer and found what I expected to find, neatly arranged files, everything in order, but when I moved to the second drawer, there was a hesitation, not from me, but from the space itself, a slight resistance as if it had been closed differently than usual, and when it finally slid open, I noticed immediately that something was missing, not in an obvious way, not like an empty space waiting to be filled, but in the absence of a particular folder that had always been there, one I knew well, one that contained original documents, documents that should never have been moved without reason. I did not panic, and I did not react, because by now I understood the pattern. This was not chaos, this was control, carefully applied, quietly executed, and I stood there for a long moment, letting that realization settle fully, because once you see the structure behind something, it loses its power to confuse you. I closed the drawer gently and stepped back, my mind no longer searching, but organizing, connecting the small details into something coherent, something undeniable, and it became clear to me then that this had been unfolding for longer than I had allowed myself to see, not because I was incapable of noticing, but because I had trusted. And trust has a way of softening the edges of reality until even the sharpest truths feel distant. I left the study and walked back into the hallway, my steps calm, unhurried, because there was no longer any need to question what was happening, only to understand how far it had gone, and more importantly, how it could be brought into the light at the right moment. And as I passed the staircase, I glanced toward the front door, imagining the ease with which Ashley and Daniel moved in and out of this house, believing everything was already secured, already theirs, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small, quiet certainty, not of victory, but of clarity, because the truth was no longer hidden from me, it was simply waiting, and I had all the time in the world to decide when it would be seen. That evening, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom, the same place where I used to write birthday cards and grocery lists, and I opened the old leather notebook I had not touched in years, its pages still carrying the faint scent of ink and time, and I began to write, not because I needed to remember, but because I needed to see it all laid out clearly, each detail placed exactly where it belonged. Because clarity is not just something you feel, it is something you build piece by piece, until there is no room left for doubt. I started with what I knew for certain, not assumptions, not emotions, just facts, the altered entries in the financial binder, the missing folder from the study, the conversation I had overheard that morning, each one written down in steady, deliberate lines, and as I moved from one point to the next, something began to take shape, not chaos, not confusion, but a pattern so precise it could not have been accidental. And that was when I understood that this was not simply about taking control of assets, it was about rewriting ownership itself, quietly shifting authority from me to them without ever asking for my consent in a way that I would recognize. I closed the notebook briefly and leaned back in the chair, my eyes drifting toward the window where the last light of the day had begun to fade, and I allowed myself a moment to think, not about what they had done, but about how they had done it, because methods reveal more than actions ever will, and their method had been patience, subtlety, consistency, the kind of approach that only works when the person being targeted believes they are safe, believes they are still part of the structure being changed around them. I stood up then and walked quietly back into the hallway, moving with the same calm intention that had guided me all day, and I made my way toward the small cabinet near the staircase where we kept miscellaneous household items, things no one paid much attention to, and inside, tucked behind a stack of unused envelopes, was something I had almost forgotten about, a small digital recorder my husband had purchased years ago during a time when he had been particularly careful about documenting conversations related to business matters, and I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight, remembering how he used to say that truth, when properly recorded, never needs to defend itself. I turned it over slowly, considering not the device itself, but what it represented, the ability to preserve what was said exactly as it was said, without interpretation, without distortion, and I realized then that I did not need to confront them with questions they would simply deny. I needed to let them speak, to let them reveal themselves in their own words, just as they already had when they believed no one was listening. I returned to my room and placed the recorder carefully on the desk, beside the notebook, aligning it with the same precision I had used for everything else, because order matters, especially when you are preparing to uncover something that others have worked so carefully to conceal. And I sat down again, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing steady, my thoughts clear. They believed I was passive, that I would accept what had been done and adjust quietly, and in a way, they were not entirely wrong, because I had no intention of creating a scene, no intention of raising my voice or demanding explanations that would lead nowhere. But what they did not understand was that acceptance is not the same as surrender, and silence is not the same as ignorance. I picked up the notebook once more and added a final line at the bottom of the page, not as a conclusion, but as a reminder, a simple sentence that grounded everything I had observed, everything I had begun to understand, and everything I was about to do, and as I set the pen down, I felt that same calm certainty settle into place again, steady and unwavering, because the truth was no longer something I needed to search for. It was something I was now ready to collect, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for them to hide behind. The next day, I did not change anything about my routine, and that was the most important part of all, because consistency creates comfort, and comfort lowers defenses, and I needed them to feel completely at ease, completely certain that nothing had shifted, that I was exactly who they believed me to be, someone who accepted quietly, someone who would not question what had already been decided. I woke at the same time, just after 6, made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring the water slowly, allowing the familiar rhythm to carry through the kitchen like nothing had changed, and when Ashley came downstairs, she paused for a moment, watching me, as if she were measuring something invisible, something she could not quite name. "You are up early," she said, her voice light, casual, but her eyes searching, always searching. I smiled gently and nodded. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, keeping my tone even, unremarkable, giving her nothing to question, nothing to analyze. Daniel followed shortly after, his steps heavier, his presence quieter than it used to be, and he greeted me with a brief nod, not unkind, but distant, like a man who had already compartmentalized something he did not want to examine too closely. We sat together at the table for a few minutes, the silence not uncomfortable for them, but useful for me, because people reveal more in what they choose not to say than in what they do, and I watched, not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a quiet awareness that had sharpened overnight. Ashley reached for her phone more often than usual, her fingers moving quickly across the screen, responding to messages she did not share, while Daniel kept glancing at her, as if waiting for confirmation, for reassurance, for something unspoken to be settled between them. And it was in those small exchanges, those almost invisible shifts, that the truth continued to take shape, clearer with each passing moment. After breakfast, I excused myself calmly, saying I needed to organize a few things upstairs, and neither of them questioned it, because it fit the version of me they had already accepted, the quiet mother, the one who tidied, who adjusted, who made space without asking for recognition, and that was exactly the role I needed them to believe in. In my room, I retrieved the small recorder and held it for a moment, considering placement, not impulsively, but strategically, because this was not about chance, it was about intention, and intention requires precision. I moved back downstairs later that morning, timing it carefully, placing the device discreetly where voices naturally carried, not hidden in panic, but positioned with quiet confidence, because I knew they would speak, not out of carelessness, but out of certainty, and certainty has a way of making people careless without realizing it. The rest of the day unfolded as expected. Ashley made calls, her tone shifting subtly depending on who was on the other end, sometimes polished and professional, other times sharp and direct, while Daniel moved through the house with a restless energy, as if he were waiting for something to finalize, something to settle completely, and I remained exactly where I needed to be, present but unremarkable, engaged but not intrusive, allowing the space to fill naturally with the conversations they believed were private. That evening, as we gathered again in the living room, Ashley began discussing future plans, small adjustments at first, changes to the house, ideas about renovations, and she spoke with a confidence that suggested ownership, not possibility, and Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a detail, occasionally hesitating just long enough to reveal that part of him still recognized the shift, even if he chose not to acknowledge it. I listened quietly, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, because there was no need to interrupt, no need to challenge, not when every word they spoke was already becoming part of something larger, something that would not need to be argued or defended later. When the night settled in and the house grew quiet again, I returned to my room and sat at the desk, the recorder now in my hand once more, and I did not play it immediately, because I already knew what it contained, not in exact words, but in essence, and I allowed myself a small, measured breath, steady and calm. Because everything was moving exactly as it needed to, not fast, not dramatic, but precise, and precision is what makes the truth impossible to ignore when it is finally revealed. That night, I finally pressed play, not with urgency, not with dread, but with a quiet readiness that comes only when you already understand what you are about to hear, and the small device in my hand came to life with a soft click, followed by the familiar sounds of the house, footsteps, the faint hum of appliances, the ordinary background of a life that had been carefully rearranged without my permission, and then their voices. Clear enough, steady, unguarded in a way that only happens when people believe they are completely alone. Ashley spoke first, her tone different from the one she used around me, sharper, more certain. Once everything is fully transferred, there is no reason to keep pretending, she said, and there was a pause, just long enough for Daniel to respond, his voice lower, hesitant. She is still my mother, he said, but the words did not carry conviction, they sounded like something he felt obligated to say rather than something he truly believed, and Ashley answered without missing a beat. And she had her time, Daniel, this is about moving forward, about what makes sense now. And I listened without reaction, not because it did not matter, but because it confirmed what I had already seen, what I had already understood without needing to hear it spoken aloud. The recording continued, revealing more than just intentions, revealing confidence, plans discussed openly, references to documents, to adjustments, to decisions that had been made long before I was ever invited to that office to sign my name, and as each piece unfolded, I felt no shock, no anger, only a deeper clarity. As if the final outlines of something I had already sketched in my mind were now being filled in with exact detail. I let the recording play all the way through before turning it off, placing the device carefully back on the desk, and for a moment I simply sat there, hands folded, eyes steady, allowing the silence to return, because silence, when it follows truth, feels different. It is no longer empty, it is full, complete, resolved in a way that leaves no space for doubt. The next morning, I moved through the house as I always had, the same measured steps, the same quiet presence, and when Ashley greeted me with her usual smile, I returned it just as calmly, because there was no need to change anything yet, not when everything was already in motion exactly as it needed to be. Daniel lingered a little longer than usual that morning, watching me in a way that suggested something unsettled within him, but he said nothing, and I did not prompt him to, because whatever questions he might have were not mine to answer, not anymore. Later that day, I made a single phone call, brief, precise, arranged without explanation, because explanations come later, when the truth is ready to stand on its own, and when I hung up, I felt that same steady certainty settle deeper, more anchored now, no longer forming, but fully present. The house remained quiet in the hours that followed, Ashley out running errands, Daniel away at work, and I used that time not to search, not to gather more, but to organize, to place each piece exactly where it belonged, the documents, the notes, the recording, all aligned with a clarity that made everything else unnecessary. By the time evening approached, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to uncover, only the timing of what would come next, and timing, I had learned, is not about speed, it is about precision, about choosing the exact moment when the truth no longer needs to be introduced, only revealed. When they returned that night, everything appeared the same routine, the same quiet dinner, the same careful exchanges, but beneath it, something had shifted, not in them, not yet, but in me, because I was no longer observing to understand, I was waiting to act, and the difference between those two states is what turns knowledge into power, and power, when held quietly, does not need to announce itself to be felt. The following morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something had reached its final stage, and I moved through it with the same quiet precision I had maintained all week, not because I needed to pretend anymore, but because there is a certain discipline in finishing what you started exactly the way you intended, without disruption, without unnecessary emotion. Ashley was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her posture relaxed, her movements confident, as if the outcome she had been working toward was no longer a possibility but a certainty, and Daniel sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his expression neutral but distant, the way it had been since the day at the attorney's office. "We have an appointment later today," Ashley said without looking up, her tone casual, almost routine, as if this was just another step in a process that had already been decided. "Just to finalize a few remaining details." I nodded once, calmly, acknowledging her words without questioning them, because there was no need to challenge anything now, not when everything was already in place exactly as it needed to be. The drive to the office was quiet, the kind of silence that is filled with unspoken assumptions, with expectations that no longer need to be voiced, and I sat in the back seat, looking out the window as the familiar streets passed by, not with nostalgia, not with regret, but with a clear awareness that this moment had been carefully constructed, not just by them, but now by me as well. When we arrived, the same conference room greeted us, the same polished table, the same neatly arranged documents, and the same attorney, who offered a polite nod as we took our seats, unaware that the balance of the room had already shifted in ways that could not be seen on the surface. Ashley spoke first, confident, composed, outlining what she believed to be the final confirmation of everything they had set in motion, her words precise, rehearsed, supported by documents she slid forward with quiet assurance, and Daniel followed with brief additions, his voice steady, though there was a slight hesitation beneath it now, something subtle, something that suggested a growing awareness he had not yet fully faced. I listened without interruption, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my expression calm, allowing them to complete the picture they believed was already finished, because there is a moment in every situation like this when speaking too soon weakens what you have, and I had waited too long, observed too carefully, to rush now. When Ashley finished, she leaned back slightly, a small, satisfied movement that said more than her words ever could, and the attorney turned his attention to me, offering the polite, expected question. "Do you have anything you would like to add?" And for the first time since this had begun, I allowed a brief pause, not for effect, not for drama, but for precision, because timing matters most when everything else is already in place. I reached into my bag calmly and placed a small stack of papers on the table, followed by the recorder, setting it down with the same care I had used for everything else, and for a moment, either of them reacted, because they did not yet understand what they were seeing, and that was exactly as it should be. "I believe there are a few details that may need clarification," I said quietly, my voice steady, measured, not raised, not sharpened, simply present, and as I spoke, I saw the first shift, not dramatic, not immediate, but real, Ashley's posture tightening slightly, Daniel's gaze lifting for the first time to meet mine, searching now instead of avoiding, and I knew then that the moment had arrived, not because I forced it, but because everything had led to it exactly as it was meant to. The attorney adjusted his glasses, glancing between the documents and the recorder, his expression changing as he began to understand that what had been presented before was not the full story, and I did not need to explain everything, not yet, because the truth, once placed in front of people, does not require persuasion, it only requires attention, and for the first time since this began, I had all of it. The room grew quieter in a way that could not be mistaken for calm, but I did not rush to fill it, because silence has a way of forcing people to confront what they would rather avoid, and I watched as the attorney picked up the documents I had placed in front of him, his eyes moving carefully across each page, his expression shifting from polite neutrality to focused attention, and then to something more serious, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her composure tightening at the edges, her confidence no longer effortless, while Daniel sat still, his gaze fixed on the table, as if looking directly at me might force him to acknowledge something he was not ready to face. "These records indicate discrepancies," the attorney said finally, his tone measured, professional, but unmistakably firm, and he glanced toward Ashley briefly before continuing. "Adjustments that were not properly authorized, and documentation that does not align with the original filings." Ashley straightened immediately, her voice controlled but sharper now. "There must be some misunderstanding," she replied, but the certainty that had carried her before was no longer present, it had been replaced by something else, something less stable. And I did not interrupt, I did not correct her, because the truth does not require assistance once it begins to speak. The attorney then reached for the recorder, looking at me briefly, seeking confirmation, and I nodded once, a simple, quiet acknowledgement, and when he pressed play, the room filled again with their own voices, not the versions they presented to others, but the ones they used when they believed no one was listening, clear, direct, undeniable, and as the recording played, I watched the shift happen fully this time. Ashley's expression tightening into something controlled but strained, Daniel's shoulders lowering as if the weight he had been avoiding had finally settled into place, and no one spoke until the recording ended, because there was nothing left to add. The attorney set the device down carefully and folded his hands, his attention now directed entirely toward them, no longer including me in the same way as before, and that was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. "We will need to pause any further actions until this is reviewed in full," he said, his voice calm but decisive, and Ashley opened her mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, realizing perhaps for the first time that this was no longer something she could guide or control through careful wording or quiet influence. Daniel finally looked at me then, truly looked at me, his expression uncertain, searching, but I did not offer him anything to hold on to, not anger, not reassurance, only the same calm presence I had maintained from the beginning, because this was not a moment for explanation, it was a moment for understanding, and understanding cannot be given, it has to be reached. I gathered my things slowly, not in a hurry, not with hesitation, simply with intention, placing each item back into my bag with the same care I had used to bring them here, and when I stood, the room seemed to settle again. Not into silence this time, but into something final, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be recognized. Ashley remained seated, her posture rigid now, her confidence replaced by stillness, while Daniel did not move at all, as if he were still processing the distance between what he had believed and what had just been revealed, and I did not linger, because there was nothing left for me to say in that room. As I walked toward the door, I paused briefly, not to turn back, not to reconsider, but simply to acknowledge what had been, what had changed, and what no longer belonged to me, and then I stepped out into the quiet hallway, the sound of the door closing behind me soft but definitive. I did not feel victory, and I did not feel loss, only a steady, grounded clarity, the kind that comes when everything has been seen exactly as it is, without illusion, without denial, and as I walked out of the building into the open air, I understood something with complete certainty. I had not needed to fight, I had not needed to argue, because in the end, it was never about destroying anything. It was about allowing the truth to stand where nothing else could.